This presentation is intended to follow on from my video on kinship, and it's intended to give you an introduction to Levi-Strauss's analysis of kinship. So I'll start off with the question of what is the basic family tie, or what is the basis of kinship for you? Is it the relation between, for example, mother and child? Or is it between father and child? Or is it between husband and wife? What do you think is the basis of kinship? Well, Levi-Strauss asked that question and came up with a different kind of answer. He said that the most important relationship is between the child and the mother's brother. Throughout the world, that's the most important relationship. And this sounds a bit weird to Westerners because we're not used to thinking of the mother's brother as a particularly important person, but for anthropologists it's so important. It's got a particular term, which is the avuncular. That is, a person's your mother's brother is your avuncular. So try and picture your mother's brother now. If you don't have one, think of your sister's husband, your sister's husband. And if you don't have a sister with a husband, think of your mother's husband. I think that'd be the closest you'd have. I'm not too sure on that, but I think that'd be the closest you'd have to an avuncular, and they would take the role of the avuncular. Okay, so let's assume Levi-Strauss has got this right. I want you to think, in your own case, who has the right or responsibility to be stricter with you, well, at least while you were a child, or maybe still now, your uncle or your father? Who's the one who, when you're in trouble, is the one that's going to tell you off? Now, in my case, I remember from being a teenager, it was my father who would be the one who would tell me off. And if I was in trouble, I remember once being in big trouble and I went to my uncle instead. So it's the father's role, I think, at least in my own society, that's Western Australia, as a white upper middle class guy. It was my father who had the responsibility to be strict, and my uncle would joke around, and and as an uncle I do this, I spoil my nieces and nephews in ways I wouldn't spoil my own children. I also joke around a lot in ways that I might not with my own children. So I guess that's my culture. Now, who do some people crave better relationships with? Again, in my culture, it's typically the father, that people complain about their father being distant and wanting a better relationship with their father. If it was between the uncle and the father, it's always the father that comes up. So what that indicates to us in our society is that there's a sort of remnant of the father being a strict disciplinarian and the uncle being a bit of a joker, and the father being distant and the father being emotionally distant and the uncle being emotionally close. Okay, now this is what Levi-Strauss does with this. He talks about the avuncular relationship and analyzes it in a very interesting way. He looks at different people. So we have an ego who's a boy down here amongst the circus. Now this ego has with his father a negative relationship, a bad relationship, or a relationship of strictness and emotional distance, which is typical of, for example, Anglo-Australian cultures, whereas the relationship with the father is close, with the mother's brother, I should say, is close. So the boy has a distant relationship of discipline with his father and of closeness with his mother's brother, his avuncular. And it's the same on Tonga. The son has a distant relationship with the father and a close relationship with the mother's brother, and it's the same. Well, that's it. In the other societies we look at, Trobriand, the Siao, and Lake Kubutu, the relationship with the father is good, but the relationship with the avuncular is distant. So we have a kind of structure emerging. The structure is If you have a negative relationship with your father, you'll have a positive relationship with the uncle. If you have a positive relationship with your father, you'll have a negative relationship with your mother's brother, your uncle, your avuncular. Now, it gets more complicated than that. Amongst the Cherkess, for example, the relationship between husband and wife is one of distance. That might sound a bit strange, but it's, if you think a lot, I'm just trying to think like sometimes marriage is thought of as a kind of a warfare between husband and wife. I mean, ideally at weddings everybody talks about how close everybody is, but in actual practice it's often conceived of, now you get that, well, in Anglo-Australian culture, for example, we will have, I'm thinking particularly of like beer ads, which will show women as kind of, and wives as kind of nags that get in the way of having fun and so on. And so I think Australian culture would have a negative there too. In Anglo-Australian culture, the husband and wife relationship, although it's idealised, it's harmonious and stuff, there's this kind of strand where it's thought of as also one of tension and so on. So amongst the Cherkess, the husband and wife have a kind of distant relationship, if you make sense of that, whereas the relationship between the sister and the brother over here is one of affection and closeness. So the Cherkess is probably, if we can do structural analysis, the relationship between, relationships here are, I'd say, typical of Anglo-Australian culture. That is, father has a strict relationship with son, and father has a kind of competitive or distant relationship with wife. However, sister has close relationship with brother, and son over here has a close relationship with sister's brother. Now, again, we see a kind so with the Cherkess and also, all right, to continue with the analysis, I'll now move to my blog. We've just looked at the Cherkess, right? So I'm going to look at it in relation to this diagram. So in the diagram, I'm going to use underlining for intergenerational, that is father, son, and uncle, nephew. I'll italicize the brother-sister relationship, and I'll put the avuncular relationship in bold. Okay, so the Cherkess who we've looked at, there's a positive relationship between uncle and nephew, that is the avuncular, and a positive relationship between brother and sister. So they can sleep together in the same bed, not have sex, but sleep together in the same bed. The husband and wife, by contrast, there's a negative relationship. You shouldn't ask, for example, about somebody's wife's health. They can't say, how's the wife? And there's no sort of show of public affection between husband and wife. We can contrast that, according to Levi-Strauss, with the Trobriand Islanders. There we see a positive relationship between father and son, and a positive relationship between husband and wife. The negative relationship there is between uncle and nephew, and also between brother and sister. So there's a rigid taboo between brothers and sisters, so the relationship is very reserved, and if you say somebody you resemble your sister, that's considered to be a grave insult, according to the sources that Levi-Strauss was using. Now, the important thing is, in both groups, the relationship between the maternal uncle, I was about to call it, it's called the munkle, or the avuncular, and the nephew is to the relationship between brother and sister, as a relationship between father and son is that to husband and wife. So let's look at this, break it down. Relationship between maternal uncle and nephew, here is negative, is to the relationship between brother and sister, which is also negative, as the relationship between father and son is as to the relationship between brother, husband and wife. So the relationship between the avuncular relationship is negative. So the brother-sister relationship is negative. The father-son relationship is positive. So therefore, the husband-wife relationship is positive. And here we get the reverse of that. Now, let's move on to some other examples. In these relationships, say, let's go to Tonga now. It's positive relationship between husband and wife, and the positive relationship between, positive relationship between husband and wife, and a positive relationship between uncle and nephew. So the nephew in Tonga is fahu, which means above the law. So the nephew can kid and tease his uncle and get away with that. By contrast, the nephew finds that his father is tapu and cannot be touched. Is like kind of taboo. Tapu is, I think, one of the origins of the English word taboo. And the brother and sister are also tapu or taboo. They cannot even be under the same roof after a certain age. So here, positive, if we go back to the relationship between maternal uncle and nephew, positive is to negative as negative is to positive. So I could keep on doing this, but the main point is if we keep on doing it, we'll find positive here is always negative there, or negative here is always positive. These are binaries. These are what you call the binary terms of structuralism. Similarly, a negative relationship between husband and wife is always related to a positive relationship between sister and brother. So on Lake Kubutu in New Guinea, the relationship between brother and sister is quite close. So if the sister is being beaten by the husband, as often happens, she runs to her brother for refuge. The relationship between uncle and nephew is negative. They both fear the sorcery of each other. And the relationship between the son and the father is positive. So again, if we have a negative relationship between the generations here, we'll have a positive relationship between the generations here. And if we have a negative relationship within the generation between sister and brother, then we'll have a negative relationship between husband and wife. So basically, kinship is founded on structured relationships between the four pairs: sister, brother, wife, husband, father, son, and nephew, uncle. All right, I'll leave it at that.